Hey everybody! In this video we're going to be talking about making skin tones using dry media like colored pencils or chalk pastels. I encourage you to check out my previous video kind of detailing the complexities of skin tone and everything that kind of goes on as we are analyzing the colors within a portrait or whatever you're drawing that involves skin tone. For this video, I am going to just work on developing a few different skin tones. So I'm going to do kind of light, medium, dark skin tones just to kind of show you the variety of color and hue that kind of goes into mixing a skin tone. It's more than just brown or peach. You know, there's a lot of depth to it. So I think I'm going to start with dark first, and I'm just going to focus in on like one section. So even looking at my reference, there's such a variety of hue happening in here. We have this transition from dark to light with the lighting. It's kind of cooler in the highlight, but very warm in the middle areas. And so I'm not going to focus on drawing anything per se. I'm really just going to look at the color and how those are going to be created. So one thing as you are developing colors, especially, well, I guess with any kind of media, is you don't want to build it up too fast, because if your color buildup is too thick right away, you won't be able to add more. Your paper kind of has a maximum amount of color that goes into, or of layering and media buildup that goes into it before it just stops. So I'm going to start by lightly building up my color as I go. And one thing that's really important with colored pencil, and really like any media, is layering is so important, especially when we're talking about skin tones. Very rarely are you ever going to be using like one flat color to create a skin tone, because it shifts so much. So right now I'm starting with just a variety of browns and kind of warmer yellows and oranges, but one thing to kind of make note is that skin tones have more than just the colors you think you're going to have in there. You know, it's going to be more than just brown in a darker skin tone. There's evidence of blues and violets and reds. There's a whole bunch of colors in here. And one thing that's helpful as we are building up these colors is to, you know, maybe do it digitally and play with like a color picker tool just to kind of see in different areas of the skin how it's different and maybe how those different colors appear as we're working. So I'm going back and forth quite a bit to build up these colors, and I'm noticing like in these darker areas there is kind of like there's a darker brown, but there's also kind of a bluish violetish sort of undertone there that I'd really like to bring out. And obviously, depending on the depth of your colored pencil selection, you may have to create a nice grayish violet using reds and blues. If I really wanted to challenge myself, I could do all of this with a double primary system. And you see how adding that violet really creates some depth in the skin tone, which is really pleasant. And as we layer the colors, there gets to be sort of this translucency to it, which is really enjoyable. What I enjoy about colored pencils so much is how we can really push the layering, and we can really develop these colors so intensely, especially if you choose to kind of work on a toned paper. That can be really fun to build up from like a mid-range or a dark value instead of starting with white. Honestly, my favorite thing is using toned paper with colored pencil because I can really create some great color buildups there. Now this area of highlight here is kind of a challenging color for me. I feel like the more I zoom in, the more abstracted it becomes, so I get a little less distracted by what it is I'm looking at, and I'm just focusing on the color. And so now I see it needs to be a lot more pink, a lot lighter. I might need to add in some white, maybe even some violets. And we need to kind of have a nice transition of the yellow into the cooler pink areas. So as I add the white in here, it's interesting because white kind of acts as a blender more so than anything else. And it really changes, in order to like actually lighten your values, it really changes the consistency of your colored pencil. So that's something to keep in mind. So I'm noticing there's like a very large difference in texture between these two areas. So I'm going to want to adjust that as I build up my values in the darker areas and the mid-range values. So much of this process is really about looking deeply at the color and analyzing it. And I feel like I said earlier, it's so easy to get lost in what our brain is like recognizing as an object or a person. And then your brain tells you like this is what it is, rather than like really looking closely at what we're actually seeing, which is usually quite a bit different. So I feel like I need to get some more violets in these areas over here, kind of like looking at the play of warm and cool and how they interact with one another. So by zooming in on my reference, I'm thinking less about the person and I'm thinking more about the color. It just helps me kind of step away from the image. As I begin to layer more, I'm really starting to burnish with the colored pencils, creating that like very thick waxy layer over everything. This play between the violet and dark brown is just so rich. But I don't want it to get too dark. Alright, so I have this nice kind of gradient of warm, dark skin tone. So this is kind of my primary colors that I use, but then I also used a variety of pinks and violets throughout there too. Maybe I should just keep all of these together. Wouldn't that be easier? I think the complexity of skin tones can really allow you to play with those colors and those mixtures for like layers and layers and layers until you really find that perfect combination and mixture of layering. Let's move on to a medium skin tone. So as we look at the medium skin tone, this is a little bit more of a olive hued skin tone, so not quite so warm and rich as the darker one we were looking at. It's got a slight green cast to it, hence why we call it the olive skin tone. As I begin with this one, I want to reach for maybe like a really cool brown to start with as we develop the shadows. So while we're working on skin tones, I think it's like really, really important to understand the difference between warm and cool colors. Because when you understand how those different casts work and like how colors can lean one way or the other in terms of their warmth or coolness, it's really going to help you understand the colors that you're seeing and how to create the colors that you're seeing. And I don't think there's really any sort of like quick fix for this. I think it's really like just a lot of practice and a lot of looking. As I'm working with my colored pencils, I'm using Prismacolors. They're the, I don't know how many I have. Is it the 72 count set? So I do have a pretty wide range of colors to work with, which allows me a little more variety as I'm developing things, but it's definitely not necessary to have, you know, every color ever created in your palette. Kelp Green sounds fun. I'm going to do a really, really light overlay with this. You don't want to overdo it, but I just want to get that slight cast. So I'm doing just very, very gentle, light strokes, and that just kind of cools this down even more. All right, now I'm going to kind of build up some of the yellows. And I really feel like I need something in between the browns and the yellows just a little bit more. They're not quite ready to mesh together here. Need some intermediate values. There we go. That's getting better. Now I feel like my shadow is slightly warmer than what I have it, so I'm going to just kind of pull in a nice dark red in here to kind of warm up that shadow. Just a tish. I don't want to do it too much. It still is relatively cool in comparison to this one. I may even want to go in with the green again. It's a little bit heavier in the shadows this time. And mixing that red and green together gives you the complementary mix, which is going to give you kind of a rich, neutral, grayish brown. And I think doing that did just the trick for pushing this back, getting that play between warm and cool. I think it's also important to understand just color theory as a whole, like what happens when you mix certain colors. Understanding like the complementary colors and understanding how those things mix together is really going to help you as you are looking at colors. Like, how do I make this? What's even happening here? And like I always say, the best way to get better at it is to practice. I know, working, it's so hard. It's not always enjoyable or fun. Sometimes it is. I mean, I enjoy it, but I know I also struggled as I was learning all this stuff. But the struggle is where the growth happens. If you're not struggling, you're not challenging yourself enough. All right, I think that's pretty good for laying down kind of an olive-hued medium skin tone. Let's move on to light. So the light skin tone that I chose to work with is very cool. You know, it's nearly white here, but we can see these sort of like bluish undertones throughout. So as we look at this, it's going to be very subtle. There's like a lot that's very close to white, and so we don't want to overdo it in this instance. But I think the key things here is that I'm like really focusing on those undertones. So like what colors am I seeing throughout the skin tone here? I'm seeing some kind of yellows, some blues, maybe like rosy purples around the eyes. The color gets slightly warmer on the eyelids and the nose, kind of where we see a bit more of the capillaries happening. I have kind of like this grayish green blue color here, and slightly more blue. And it's just so easy to get caught up in looking at the figure rather than the color. So I need to zoom in to ignore all that extra information that I don't need right now. And what's challenging with this skin tone is if I go even just slightly too hard with any of these colors, it's going to be too dark because it's just such a fair tone, which makes it a little harder to work with, in my opinion. Because if it's overdone, then we're not going to get the right sort of consistency and color mixture. Now I think as I add the white, it's kind of lacking the depth that I'm hoping for here. It needs a little bit more, I think a little more yellow in the upper areas here. There's kind of this slight interplay between the warm and the cool on this face. I'm noticing, you know, like the differences between the pink and the yellow and the blue. They kind of go back and forth as we're developing it. We want to kind of mimic what we're seeing there. So kind of that play between the blues and the yellows and the pinks. I need to find a way to kind of blend this pink in a little bit more so it looks a little less bruised and a little more natural. Yeah, I think I overdid this pink here. So I need to find a way to kind of neutralize it to blend it in more so that it works with the image and the colors that I'm seeing. Now that I'm looking at this, I feel like there almost needs to be a little more like a violet undertone here. So I do see more of a blue cast throughout, but there's just a few areas that have more of the violet in it. And I think I need to push that blue just a little bit more again. I really enjoy doing the skin tones where there's kind of like more colorful hues buried within them to show like the complexity of the color of the skin, but sometimes I don't like to blend them in, and I like to let those hues really just shine through so that we see these pops of violet and pops of blue, pops of yellow, especially when I'm working with watercolor, which will probably be our next video on skin tones. I love to see how they kind of layer and interact with one another. I think that's probably the most interesting part of working with skin tones, is getting those like sort of more subjective colors building up. Since I'm really struggling with this one spot that I use this color in, I need to kind of pull it throughout the area just a little bit to kind of balance that spot so it's not so obviously just a splotch. So I'm just going to kind of lightly add it to some of the darker areas to balance things out just a little bit. And then I noticed like I just did some hatchy lines there, and I feel like that made it difficult to blend. So now I need to do kind of a little bit of scumbling over the area to very off-white gray here and see if that'll do the trick. I think these like very pale skin tones are actually really challenging to work with, to kind of build up and not look splotchy and gross, which it kind of does right now. So, you know, we all have our struggles. I think I overdid it, and that's kind of easy to do with colored pencil if you aren't careful. Well, her cheeks kind of got a bit of a heat map feel going on to it. However, I feel like if I were to kind of finish this area and continue working with it and like add details, that it would probably balance itself out nicely. But as I have mentioned to you at the beginning, I've hit the point of no return here. So I've fully burnished this area. I'm not really able to add any more colored pencil on here. If I wanted to and was feeling really bold, I could take an X-Acto knife or a utility knife and use the flat of the blade to kind of scrape off a layer, which actually on this paper is working pretty nicely. So I could do this and then go back in and build up my colors a little bit more, which I think I will do. This method is dangerous if you don't do it properly, because if you get the point of your blade onto your paper at any point, it's going to leave some indents which you will not be able to cover up. And that is bad news. So as you can see here, there is like a little bit of the paper on here, and this is, you know, definitely eating into the paper. So we want to be careful when doing this method. It's kind of a last resort if needed. So now that I've scratched things off, you can see kind of where I had more staining pigments, the ones that like to stick and not go anywhere. So I'm not really going to add any more of those because I learned my lesson. I'm really just going to focus on kind of the lighter values here and slowly build up the skin tone from those with just the sort of underlayment of those other colors here. And hopefully that should just give us a really nice skin tone without too much subjective color within it, which is always fun. Definitely, don't get me wrong. I love subjective color in a portrait, but if we're aiming for realism, we'll take it down a notch. So you'll notice that after I scrape, there is like a slight change in the texture of the paper. This is just something you got to deal with if that is a method you want to work with, so you got to be really careful about it. And I think I'll just finish off this area with kind of a blending layer of white to lighten the value and also blend the colors. It gives it a very soft pastel look. which is really what we're aiming for with this light of a skin tone. All right, so there we have it, a variety of skin tones from warm and dark to a neutral to a cool and fair skin tone. So you can see that there's a huge variety of hue put into this. It's not just like a one-size-fits-all approach, because we really have to focus on warm and cool colors, on our color theory, and isolating certain areas to see what's going on here. So stay tuned for more videos on skin tone with different media next time. Thanks for watching and keep creating.